how do you respond when you're late and you get stuck behind a large truck, moving slowly? I imagine however we respond, it isn't probably patiently. Because we planned poorly, or maybe something's come up that has made that, almost an impossibility. And when we become impatient, we tend to take out our impatience on those around us. It's not the truck driver's fault that he can only do 5 miles an hour. It's our fault for being slow and getting behind him to begin with. And so we tend to nitpick with those around us. Well, in James chapter 5, James wants to warn us as believers that we need to understand that we are patiently waiting for the Lord. But our problem is that we don't tend to be patient people. And so James begins this section by telling us of a tenacity that we need to have in order to live the Christian life. He says in James 5 and in verse 7, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains." See, patience is a necessary character trait of any believers. And it comes with the idea of being strong, of fortitude, of being willing to bear up under difficult circumstances, because when we live the Christian life, we've made a decision to live counter to the ones around us. And so persecution will come because of that. And therefore we need the patience to wait until God returns. And so he sets out that goal for us. How long are we to be patient? Well, until the Lord returns. We're not to be patient for a few years. It's until it all comes to an end and we are vindicated by it. Because the coming of the Lord is used to denote the end of human history. And when Jesus returns, well, he's going to come in judgment against those who do not know him, but he's going to vindicate those of us who have been patiently waiting on him. And so when we are patiently waiting for him, we need to remember vindication is coming, and that we need to be willing to put in the long haul. And so he says the farmer displays this attitude of patience. He tills his crop, he plants it, and then he needs to just sit there and wait until it brings forth a harvest. Now, farming in Palestine is a pretty tricky business, because you would have early spring rains that would moisten the soil, that would get your plant started, but then you went through a long, dry summer. And you had to wait until the late fall rains came, until your crop would completely mature and you'd be able to harvest it. And so the farmer would plant his crop, and he would have to depend on the weather coming so that he would be able to have anything at all. Well, like the farmer, we need to patiently wait until the Lord comes, so that we can see the harvest of our fruit and the willingness for us to labor in the field of God. James reiterates this call for patience. He says in verse 8, "You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." And so we are to be patient by establishing our hearts for the Lord's coming. Now, this establishing is the idea of being firmly planted, rooted, grounded. That we focus on our faith in Jesus, and we allow absolutely nothing to move us off our faith. That no matter what persecutions come, no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, that we remain steadfast and true to what God has given us. So difficult circumstances aren't going to move us away from our connection with God. And he states that the Lord's return is at hand or near. Well, here we are, 2,000 years later, and we're trying to make sense of what James says here. Well, early Christians believed that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. And so they had this expectation that Jesus was going to come at any moment. Therefore, you needed to be ready no matter what. Well, the problem is 32, Jesus says, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And so instead of getting wrapped up in the fact that they had this immediate expectation, and what does that mean for us? Folks, we didn't need to have the same expectation. We should behave as people who believe that the return is imminent, that it's going to come at any moment possible. And so what do we need to do?
Be ready.
Always be ready. Always be prepared for the Lord's return, so that when it happens, we're not caught unaware or off guard. Now it appears that James gets off a little tangent here in verse 9. He says, "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." Now his prohibition against grumbling fits his warnings about sinful speech and about how we as people tend to be critical of others. And we tend to get critical when we're under stress, right? The person who normally doesn't bother you, when you're stressed, suddenly, their irritation grows up, doesn't it? And so when we're under stress, under persecution, what are we naturally going to do? Well, we're naturally going to start nitpicking each other. We're going to start armchair quarterbacking each other's spirituality and taking out our frustrations on one another. And so the need to be patient in suffering also means that we need to be patient for one another. The Apostle Paul links patience to our willingness to love one another, bearing with each other. We don't like to think about this, but sometimes we're a bear to live with. Sometimes we're a bear to get along with because of the stresses that we're going under. And so we need to be careful that even though we might be going through stressful times, even though we might be having difficulty, that we don't start taking out our frustration on each other. Because it's too easy for us while we're going under some persecution, while we're dealing with some type of stress in our life, to turn and to look at everybody else and go, well, if they would get their family act together, and those people over, and we begin criticizing one another. And criticism doesn't help. Criticism isn't beneficial for helping us as a body of believers to grow in love toward one another. Obviously we want to help each other. And sometimes that means saying things that are unpleasant to those who maybe don't want to hear it. But there's a big difference between trying to help somebody improve and just criticizing them because you're in a bad mood. And so their motivation to control themselves is linked to the judgment. He says, you be careful about grumbling against your brother or sister because the judge is standing at the door. Did you ever have the experience that you were grumbling about somebody and just turned around and they caught you? Yeah? Well, how do you feel then? You're embarrassed, aren't you? Oh, I didn't mean it. But yes, you did mean it. You're only sorry because you got caught. We need to be careful because Jesus is the judge. And if there are any slacker saints, Jesus will take care of it. It reminds me of kids. When I was a kid and my mom would tell me to do something, I would immediately launch into defense mode. Well, my brothers, and I would tell all the things they weren't doing. And my mom would tell me, mind your own business, let me take care of it. Well, I've learned that this is a character trait of all children everywhere, and I've passed on the curse to my children. Because I'll tell them they need to take care of something. Well, Sissy isn't doing this. Well, my brother, I tell them, take care of yourself. I'll take care of the other sibling. Well, Jesus says, you be mindful of you, and you let the judge take care of those who aren't doing what they need to do. And that we need to realize that we don't want to be found on the wrong side of Jesus at the judgment, do we? Since we don't know when the return happening, since we don't know when the judge is going to open the door, then be careful and be always mindful and ready for his return in our lives. So James returns to his illustrations of patience. He says in verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Now he wishes to reinforce this idea of patience under duress while serving God. Because the prophets were men of God who were given a message. And this message was one that the people who God wanted to hear it, they didn't want to hear this message. And so when the prophets came out and they started telling people things that they didn't want to hear, then how did people respond to it? Well, they didn't get upset with God, did they? They got mad at the messenger. And that these people were persecuted. Here God was sending them a person who they needed to listen to, someone they needed to pay attention to in order to get their lives back straight. And here were these people suffering, doing what God wanted them to do, and their reward for doing what was right was persecution. Now, folks, doing God's will can lead to suffering. And if we're going to patiently wait for the return of the Lord, we've got to accept that fact. We've got to stop being shocked and surprised when the world doesn't agree with us. We've got to begin to expect it, because when we expect it, it's not such a big deal. When we know that it's coming, it hurts, but at least we know it's there. It's sort of like going to the doctor's office and they're telling you, they lie, they say it's only going to hurt a little bit. They try to warn you at least that it's going to be painful. Well, folks, standing up for what's right is going to be painful. It's going to cause problems. But we want to remain grounded and steadfast in God. We're not going to allow those persecutions to move us away from our faith. We're going to hold true to them. And we're going to patiently wait for God's vindication of what we've been doing. He gives a further illustration. Verse 11, he says, behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord and how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. See, those who are willing to remain steadfast, James says, are considered blessed. And this lines up with the teaching of Jesus. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now this word blessed, a lot of times in some translations gets used, the word happy gets put in there. This isn't the idea that you ought to be emotionally ecstatic when you suffer persecution, but rather you're blessed because your connection with God remains steadfast. You're blessed because persecution is a sign that you're on the right track. Because if you're doing what the world is doing, of course you're not going to be persecuted. You're going to do what God wants you to do, persecution's going to come. People aren't going to like it. And so we want God's favor, and therefore we ought to consider ourselves blessed by it. Another illustration of patience, James brings up the example of Job. And we're familiar with that example of Job, who had his family, his fortune, everything taken from him. He had his health ripped away from him for no other reason than Satan wanted to see how far he could push Job. And yet Job, through his steadfastness, through his patience, remained faithful to God. And because of that, in the end of the story, he is justified. He is vindicated for his ongoing faith. We need to follow that example. We need to remember that no matter what circumstances we might be going through, the Lord is compassionate. He's merciful. He cares about us. In fact, he reminds us that the Lord has a purpose for us. that he is compassionate, that he is merciful. You know, the Lord's purpose for us is that he wants to redeem us from a corrupt world that does not have our interest at heart. And because I know the Lord has a purpose for you and for me, then it ought to give us patience, realizing that God does have a plan for us. And even if I buckle under the pressure, even if I make the mistakes of doing the very thing that the persecution wanted me to do, then I also serve a Lord who is merciful and compassionate. He continues to forgive. He continues to work with me and try to make me better than I was before. He forgives me of those wrongs and helps me move in a forward direction. And so being a disciple of Jesus is going to invite criticism and persecution into our lives. Folks, accept it, acknowledge it, realize it, so that we can move on with it. Stop being shocked, stop being surprised, stop talking about the Christian nation we used to have, and realize that we are called by God to follow his standard, no matter where our culture goes. That we need to build up our defenses by grounding ourselves in God's truth so that we can not be moved from our faith no matter what may happen to us. No matter what tragedy may befall us, no matter what persecution may come, that we have grounded ourselves in our faith before God, that we know that we're going to remain faithful to him no matter what, because he is going to reward us for our faithfulness. Remember, we're being patient until his return, until we're vindicated. Therefore, we continue to build and to help ourselves become greater in him. We don't allow relationships to move us away. We don't allow circumstances to move us away. We don't allow anything to do that. That we remain patiently, firmly planted in God. And you know what? When we remain faithfully planted in God's favor, we become a source for others to do the same. We become a forest that protect each other from the harshness of the world around us. Now, as we wait for the Lord's return, we don't need to grumble against one another. We don't need to complain about each other. Your spirituality, where you are at right now, if you were honest, you would admit that it's not where you were at probably a couple years ago. You've grown in your faith, I hope you have. You've become stronger. Things are a little bit more clearer for you, and so you understand things maybe you didn't understand before. Well, why not give your Christian brother or sister the benefit of the doubt? And just think that maybe they haven't had that experience before. They haven't gone through that before, and so they're struggling with it for the first time. And so maybe they're going to make mistakes. And even if they do, folks, do we really want to criticize each other for making mistakes? You know, my mom always told me that when I was pointing my finger at somebody else, I had three pointing back at me. Now, folks, maybe we need to remember that. Stop pointing our fingers at everybody else and remember that we've got our own faults. We've got our own problems. Now, let's love, let's encourage, let's build each other up, let's challenge each other to greater heights. Let's not grumble and complain about one another. That does nothing but serve the purpose of Satan and break us apart. That Jesus is coming. And so we need to always be ready for his return so that we're never caught off guard and we're never found unprepared. That we realize that his return is actually near. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we're guaranteed it is going to happen. And so let us always be ready for it. Let's ground ourselves in our faith. Let's realize that no matter what circumstances we find us in, that we need to remain faithful to God no matter what. That we tie our knot at the end of the rope and we hang on. Because we know when Jesus returns, we will be vindicated. We will be rewarded for being faithful to him, and that we will see the fruit of our labor. I want to encourage anyone present this morning who is not a disciple of Jesus to become one. Now I realize I haven't painted a pretty picture. I've told you that you're going to be in trouble for doing it. But it is the best life to live. Because we have a God who always has our back. Amen. And that even if they take our lives from us, we will still be victorious. Right. That can't be promised anywhere else. That if you will accept your Lord in faith, you'll confess Him as such, to be washed in the waters of baptism, to be raised to a new life with Him, a new beginning. Folks, new beginnings are great because we worship a God who gives us multiple new beginnings every day and who allows us to start over every time we mess up. And so I want to encourage those of us who've already made that commitment. Waiting is worth it. Being patient is what allows us to be faithful to God no matter what, and that we encourage each other in our discipleship to God. If you need to respond to the invitation or you have a prayer request you want to share, we encourage you to come forward and make that known while we stand and sing.